Hi, all, and thank you so much for tuning into today's program with Shalom Auslander and Dan Harmon. I'm Andrea Grossman, the founder of Writer's Bloc, now in our 25th year. Shalom Auslander is one of the funniest and most audacious writers I've ever had the pleasure of reading. His sheer joy in upsetting Orthodox apple carts and upending any Jewish sacred cows seems to increase as he matures. Nobody makes me squirm and shudder more as I belly laugh at his take on ritual, religion, Jewish upbringing, and all that comes with. He's one of the most memorable and starkly funny Jewish American writers around. I call him a bad boy, Philip Roth. Now Auslander takes off on a different course, but the themes are still the same. In Mother for Dinner, Auslander treats us to a much misunderstood minority group, the Can-Ams, or Cannibal Americans. Our hero, who now rejects the rigors and rituals of his tribe, casts himself as a cultural cannibal. There's so much guilt and so much tradition and so much history he must contend with. Yes, all of you will have questions, and we know that. So email us at reservations@writersblockpresents.com, and we'll try to address them. Dan Harmon is a writer who understands the powerful push-pull of community, no matter how dysfunctional. He did, after all, create the terrific sitcom Community, as well as the hugely popular Rick and Morty. Like Shalom, Dan makes us squirm and laugh really hard. I urge you to visit our website for a link to Shalom's book. Chevalier's bookstore has signed book plates. And if you appreciate our programs, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution to Writer's Bloc to keep them going. Thank you. It's such a delight to present Shalom Auslander and Dan Harmon.
Thank you.
Hello.
All right, let's chat.
Dan, did you have a microphone in your closet before COVID?
Yes.
I thought you did.
Yeah, the world keeps meeting me where I already am, from the grunge movement when everyone stopped using shampoo, and I was like,
yeah.
What took you guys so long?
Wow, I haven't been showering for ages.
Yeah, and now I live in an introvert's paradise. I already worked in animation. It's like I have nothing but guilt about how the world's proceeding, because it seems to just keep on meeting me more than halfway. And screwing over everyone else. But
I feel like the complete opposite of that.
Guilt is a big topic today. I think if we're going to talk about your work, your personality, this story, I got to try to walk a tightrope between just discussing this book, which I just finished, which I'm really fascinated by and would love to just have a piece of pie and talk about the book from start to finish, but that might be a disservice to some people here who have yet to read the book, and who also, even if they have read the book, they don't want to just listen to some knucklehead like me talk about something they already read. So I'm trying to split the difference. I've never had this job before, but I'm just gonna try to talk to you and ask you things that I'm genuinely curious about. And I think the first thing for any strangers and bad friends like me that didn't pay enough attention, just give me a little bit of your biography. I guess the questions that stand out are sort of how gigantic was your family, and how tribal was your upbringing?
Yeah. Abraham and Sarah, that tribal. Brothers throwing another brother in a hole because they wanted their father's jacket, that kind of thing. It was, for me, it's always been trying to figure out, and I guess that's why I write, is just trying to figure out what the elements were. So there's the screwy family part, and then there's the screwy theological community tribe part. And they mix, they mesh, they overlap. But for me, I think what was so bizarre was living in a family with a really dysfunctional group of people, sort of ruled over by this evil male who got drunk and crazy and violent. And then as a and I'm 6-7 years old, and I'm going off to yeshiva, and they're telling me the entire world is set up that way, and there's an evil drunken guy in the sky, and he is going to kill you if you do the wrong thing. So,
Yeah.
so don't touch his porn, because then you're really in trouble.
That was the innovation of the Old Testament. That's what it brought, was like,
Yeah.
it was the Pulp Fiction of religions. It's like,
Yeah. I mean,
forget your Marvel polytheism like religion where everyone's these vapid like superheroes. Here, daddy's home and he's been drinking. He's got standards for his covenant.
Yeah. He was so bad that a bunch of years later, Jesus Christ came around and said, you know what? He like Jesus is like Flanders to Yahweh's Mr. Burns. He's like, I'll be the guy you can come talk to. But it didn't change anything.
Yeah,
God was still crazy.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say he was, Yahweh was so severe that, it was too severe for Christians, which is a lot, like we're like, come on, let's make this a little more Terminator 2. Let's PG this, make Edward Furlong the star and just kind of,
which is always so funny, which is so weird, because then I'll have like someone who's Christian or whoever, Catholics, just say, wow, yeah, you Jews have a lot of guilt, and your God was, we don't have that Old Testament God. I'm like, yeah, you fucking do. What are you talking about? What do you think? He's like
Ted Nugent's always referring to in the Second Testament. It's funny because as a sort of lapsed Protestant from the Midwest too, and we'll talk about. I want to get back to like growing up. Like, would you say Orthodox? Was your family Orthodox? It's like I got to, like, with my vanilla upbringing, even though God was a boogeyman, because it was still like rough, like religion had rough associations with it. It was always the bad guy. It was like, I can't imagine having it be actually like kind of like in your house or in your, I got to access God as like this kind of strange concept, and then come to appreciate it through the likes of Joseph Campbell and things, and I can even get into Old Testament stories. But what is it like when religion is truly household, like it's the way things operate?
Yeah, it's terrifying. I mean, it's like a it's like a Twilight Zone. There's you come to this town and there's a monster there, but no one wants to talk about it. Everyone's saying
How
the
much
monster.
of it felt like it was coming down into your house from above, and therefore your house is running on rules that are extrinsic, and how, as opposed to, this thing is our culture and we're using it to justify kind of what turned out to be organic dysfunction?
A bit of both. It started with, this is just the way it is. This is who we are. This is our community. And then as things went south, family wise, then those rules, then I started to see how those rules were being used and manipulated to justify their behavior, or to keep me from, getting too close to the front door and running for it. And so it works like that. It works like, here's a halfway decent idea that some ancient people came up with because they were terrified. And I get that. I'm not ancient and I'm terrified. So I understand them going, hey, I know how this works. The sun is God. And like, I get all that. But then very quickly it becomes, you take one more bite of that cheeseburger and you're out of the family. And it's really hard to figure out how those things all, connect. But as a little kid, I think the worst thing was that they reinforced one another. If I'd had a happy family, then I would go to school and hear about, bad God gets angry because man steals apple. And I'd be like, well, I don't really know any people like that. And that sounds a little made up, because that's not how people really behave. So I'm just going to go home and hang out with my dad. But in my house, if you stole an apple, you were going to get thrown out of Eden. So it was like, oh, of course that's real. Of course it's genuine. And so I developed this very personal, unfortunately personal relationship with a God that even today, I'm a, left-wing commie pinko liberal, and I still can't get that idea out of my head. When shit hits the fan, when I get sick, when my son gets ill or whatever it is, that's where I go. Oh, it's punishment.
So there is you think it's possible to just hardwire into people in a way that can't be overwritten,
Oh yeah.
you could become a functional atheist, you could become a cognitive atheist, you could go, I understand the Big Bang and I understand all these different religions and that they're metaphors and that, but you just by virtue of our developmental years, having mythology a certain kind hammered into us and associated with our real lives, like you took a cookie, now you're going to get a spanking, and the reason is because we're Jewish, we're Catholic. You and I as adults are sitting here, and I can testify to the fact that, like, I'll be in the writer's room, and if there's just a certain like kind of phrase that I'll say about Jesus Christ or something, and I'll have this ping of damn it, I know this is real and I'm going to get cancer now or something.
Right. Yeah.
I can't escape it. I almost
Sure. Well,
feel like that's why Catholics genuflect like a nervous tick or something.
Yeah. Well, look, the Jesuits have that saying, give me the boy till he's 7 and I'll show you the man. Basically, that's saying, here's our plan. We screw him up royally, and all we need him for is the first 7 years. And after that, we're home free. Because when he's 70, he's going to be on his deathbed saying, oh, God damn it. Yeah. Sorry.
I think the really unfair and insidious thing about that is that they, and it's the system, whatever, the system that gets created when we treat each other like that, when we raise each other like that, that thing doesn't care if you're a smart guy, you were disenfranchised by it emotionally, but you were still disenfranchised about it within it. Like you said, you're going to grow up to be a writer, so you have a certain shaped brain. So talk about this relationship that you formed with this God that was being given to you like cod liver oil, and you were having bad experiences with and probably resented, but it's not as simple as just rebelling against it. You don't get to just go read Bertrand Russell and just like hang out and not believe in God anymore. Yeah. You had to, in your home, you had to, what does that relationship look like when you're a kid and it's not your parents' covenant now, it's yours? And what was that process?
There's a lot of talking. There's a lot of talking back and forth with him. A lot of haggling. I mean, we're Middle Eastern, so ultimately there's a lot of haggling. There's deal making and begging, and for me, very quickly that turned into just outright hatred, which is what happens with an abusive father or an abusive husband.
Hatred of the God, resentment of the power.
There's actually a long and unfortunately, people don't give it enough attention, but history of something called misotheism, which is not atheism and saying I don't believe in a God. It's saying I believe in God and he's an asshole.
It's my job to go get him. That's very ancient Greek.
Yes, it is.
Greeks sort of looked at gods as assholes, and they said, it's because they're immortal. If you're going to live forever and you don't have to worry about anything, what opportunity do you ever have to self-actualize, to experience that concept of fear, sacrifice, and therefore nobility, integrity? So it was like,
and I'd rather grow up being told the gods are as messed up as you are, rather than hearing how messed up God is, but being told that he's perfect. Because none of that doesn't make any sense at all. I'd prefer to have a God who slept with his sister. At least then I can laugh at it and I can go, well, I'm not doing that, so I got a leg up on him a little bit. But the infallibility issue, it just makes you feel awful. And so the cycle that happened is that so I'm afraid of a physical dysfunctional father. Then on top of that, there's a spiritual dysfunctional father. But that dysfunctional father on earth and all the rabbis and teachers and priests and imams and everybody else who behave poorly, they get to excuse their behavior because God behaves that way as a father too. So there's no break in the cycle. There's no break in the system. There's always someone else to look up to, and that person is actually a really shitty role model, but they're validating all your shitty behavior, right? So I remember hearing this, during the Trump years when it was like, well, how are you evangelists, falling at your knees at the feet of this clearly sinful human being? And the answer is always, well, because Jesus told us that God doesn't always pick a perfect person to be his messenger.
Mhm.
And I'm like, okay, that doesn't mean that we should make that mistake. I get it if God's having a little trouble in HR and can't find the right guy for the job, and every now and then, but that doesn't mean we have to emulate that bad behavior. But as soon
Christians
as we
love that.
are,
Yeah, they love that Saul on the road story.
yeah,
He was a
yeah,
terrible guy. He was the worst guy ever, and he turned out to be the best guy. Like a bad
right,
Santa or bad,
right,
those bad blank movies. And it's dangerous because once your paradigm starts to say, plus if I hurt you, that's more proof that I love you.
right,
We're very familiar with that circuitry. That's how women are kept hostages,
yes, exactly,
in domestic abuse relationships, where it's like, well, sometimes he's nice to me and that's great. Plus, sometimes he hits me, and the reason he does that is because, and when it's all in this theme of like you're being divested of control, of agency, right? And I guess it sounds like I've entered with you into an unwitting kind of like we're we're pooping on religion, but I, let's get into like, so when you sit down and write a book like this, where obviously you're digging deep within yourself, and you're looking at the relationship between religion and people, you're clearly a guy that if somebody asked you to list the reasons why these are terrible ideas, um you'd be able to list them, but at the same time you seem to balance it all out always with, you're definitely not recommending assimilation. The what the Seltzer family calls melting in the in Mother for Dinner, this
right,
concept of the American dream, which is like, hey, look, let's all be secular, and let's kind of like, let's sand off all of our tribal edges from the old countries that we came from and our cultural religions, and let's enter into a new covenant with just capitalism, with progress and stuff. And like, the whole family agrees in your book that's villainous, or that, or rather what it is it's a scam, it's a con. Like the swarthy
right,
immigrant loses in that bargain, they get melted down, they get fucked over.
right.
However, you like you.
But the other side of that coin is, um, the way the seventh, who's the protagonist, says, is he's also chained by that history, right? So it can it can drag you down. For me, the whole reason for writing it was because I was trying to find. I found myself ever, as a human being in the world, really, uh, I would say, imprisoned by identity. It's not anything I chose, right? There was blackness, and then I'm out, and I turn around, and the woman I came out of happens to be a Jew. now, now everything is that for the rest of my life, and everything is determined by that. And I didn't pick it; it has nothing to do with me, and yet it's an enormous anchor on who I am. And so I found myself, at 40 years old in America, wondering why all around me, everyone seemed to be grasping for identities and trying to find ways to separate themselves from others. When all I ever wanted to do was melt. Like I didn't want to get rid of where I came from, but I didn't want it to define me. I just felt like, why are any of these things here? Why do we have nations? Why are we separated in these fictional ways? Like, these are bad fictions. And I started to read a lot about it. There was one book in particular called "The Lies That Bind," and it was startling because it was written by someone from Africa talking about how he doesn't know his own past, because what are nations there? What are nations anywhere? What are these things? I say I'm American. What does that mean? It doesn't mean the same thing that it meant to a Native American 500 years ago, right? It doesn't. These are all these things change, and so for me there's the religious part that was a prison, but there's also just this identity part. And so the only way I can I don't have an answer to it. All I know is I'm going to sit down today and that's what I want to write about. That's the thing that's the bug in my ear. And somehow it comes out, oh, I know. What if you're a cannibal and you're the last cannibal family? Now what do you do? So it's like, it's a moment where you just ask yourself, how did we get here and where do I go from here? Who am I? And all those sort of horrible questions we never want to think about. But for me, when Seventh talks about feeling like all he sees these days is people running around with their arms in the air, celebrating the shackles that bind them, that's my curiosity. Why do we do that? It's not a question of is it right or wrong. It's just, why do we do that? Why are we that way?
Right. It's a fascinating.
And that was the fascinating thing. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a maypole that's like, yeah, you're doing your dance around it. So in doing that, when you decide, you land on a metaphor like this, you say, what about cannibals? Which to me, as soon as I hear that, I'm like, oh, that's just a cynical thought that a white guy would say. Like, oh, what's all this multiculturalism and identity politics coming to? And like, oh, what's next? Cannibals, which is, I was telling you before this chat, like how in awe I was of your kind of cleverness, because as you go through this book, you start to realize you've engineered a sort of box that allows you to honestly discuss a bunch of problematic areas where you take a step in any particular direction and someone might misperceive you as one of them, being someone with some agenda or argument, when what you really want to express is something incredibly personal that of course has to do with this fascinating thing. In when you come up with that kind of cleverness, when you go, okay, cannibals, let's take that from being an insight to let's drill down into that. What do you then pull up a search engine and type cannibalism and take a deep dive and start getting inspired? Or did you keep cannibalism as this like mystical thing that you didn't research at all?
A little bit of both. I mean, the first few drafts, I was much more concerned or interested in the family tree. When did they get to America? You know, Ellis Island, figuring out their whole immigrant story. And, you know, for me, it's sort of like Milan Kundera once described Kafka's work as he starts with a joke and then just goes into the dark depths of it. And that for me was like, oh, right, that's what I do. So, you know, steal from the right people, I guess. But it's sort of taking it and going, okay, so it made me laugh on Monday. But on Tuesday, what if I go a little bit deeper into this? Like, that's a tough situation, right? So what I took that idea, which is a haha on one day, and somehow it crashed into this other thing that I was going through, which was I've been, because of what we were talking about earlier, I've been estranged from my family for 20 something years. I haven't spoken to any of them. And my wife's parents, since we're at that age, are getting ill. And I started to think, well, it's probably about that time where my mother kicks the bucket. And it was something that I was worrying about. Should I go to the funeral when it happens? Will I go? And it's one of those, you know, terrible questions you bring up with your shrink, and you never really get anywhere. But it was bothering me enough that when I was thinking about, oh, this character who's in a cannibal family, maybe that's his situation. And that suddenly adds family and emotion and depth to it, because it's not just a cultural question. It's, I don't know, do you eat your mother? You hated her. She's 400 pounds. You have no idea how to do it anymore. All those traditions are lost. The only guy who knows how to do it is at least pre-senile, if not totally senile. And there's 12 of you. That's a lot of meat. And so all of a sudden it's like, it's funny, but I can kind of go, wait, there's something here. And then the third element that came into it was, as I was saying, I was researching when did they get here, all this Ellis Island American history stuff. I found this thing that I just was like, I couldn't even believe it was true, which was that, you know, as I was reading about immigrants, and there's a very similar stories. They get to New York, just like today, couldn't afford an apartment. So they all go out to Henry Ford in Detroit to work at the factory. And I discovered this thing that I couldn't believe was real. But what he did was he had something called Americanization Day, which is hilariously weird. And it's basically once a year on July 4th, he would take the immigrants he had trained in his school, and it's totally demeaning. And it's like you're taking people who are like, you know, brain surgeons in the Ukraine and saying, hi, this is how a bank works. And it's horrible, but that's what it was. And on July 4th, on Americanization Day, their families would come and they'd arrive at the plant and sit down, and they'd be facing this enormous plywood cauldron, a pot, painted black, like 30 feet wide, 20 feet high, saying melting pot on it. And everybody who was graduating that day and becoming Americanized would come out one side, walk out dressed in the clothing that they were wearing in their old country, which most of them never wore anyway, but they had to go to like a prop, like a prop house.
Dirndl or whatever.
Yeah, my lederhosen from, like, nobody had it. And they'd wear it. They'd walk up a ladder down into behind this plywood thing. Behind there'd be someone from the factory who would help them take their lederhosen and all that shit off, underneath which would be a suit and tie of like the American worker. And they'd hand them a little American flag, no doubt made in China. And they'd walk out the other side, an American, and everyone would cheer. And so I was like, holy shit, that's like, you know, you got your chocolate and my peanut butter. Like I'm totally using that because it struck me that I read it first in that way, the way I've just described, of like, what a horrible, crazy, ridiculous, embarrassing, looking back from the, you know, our comfortable perch of 2020.
Very easy to
saying,
problematize it.
Yeah.
As the kids would say.
Right. But for at least some of those people, if not most, that was the best day ever. They were like, I made it. I'm fucking American. You know, I'm not, no more Russia, no more pogroms, no more purges. They didn't know, but
yeah.
But at least for the time being, no more purges. And it was like, wow, this is great. And I wanted them to now struggle with all of that and take all of that and say, okay, I'm not going to talk about Jews. I'm not going to talk about Mormons. I'm not going to talk about Muslims. I just want to have a fake group of people with all their holidays that I can invent, that they don't even remember what they're about or where they came from, and see how they manage with all of this other stuff. It's like, you know, like when you were a kid and you ordered sea monkeys and you really wanted it to be like a little civilization. Mm-hmm. So you can actually see what they do and what they build. And then you get it and it's just bugs in a bowl.
Yeah. And with the medium that you're working in, you get to do this great thing because you get to take advantage of the audience picturing people and then subverting those pictures or gradually tuning them in, because I wasn't sure if you were, and then you come to this great passage, which if I was going to have somebody read a passage from the book or something, I just love your description. I guess I just love the revelation of it, as you're partway into this book and suddenly the author is revealing with the discussion of the peculiar, almost chameleon-like complexion of the Cannibal American, which is such so that no matter where they go, they can be mistaken for any other race in the eyes of anybody with a predilection for xenophobia, really. So if you're in a Hispanic neighborhood and you're a Cannibal American, they might think you're Korean, they might think you're Black, they might Italian. It's they and I thought that was such a, to me, that's the plot point of reading this book. I'm sort of crossing a threshold of admiration for the writer at that point, where I'm like, boy, you really made me think you were going to do this kind of, oh, what about cannibals thing, but you just drill down into this thing and find you find the reason why it's important, why that would make the perfect metaphor for discussing all these matters. One thing that I'm curious about, when you talk about this this 1917 Americanization ritual, I remember you telling me about that, and you were all excited as a writer that you had just discovered that. I don't know if you remember that conversation, but you were telling
Yeah,
me about that. And I remember my weird my reaction to that is way more on the other side of like, oh, what a cute, beautiful thing, with an asterisk on. Of course, that's so heavily problematizable. That's such a cringy, not a good look, in the parlance of
bad
millennials kind of thing.
optics,
I can
bad
see
optics.
why. Bad idea, not going to lead to any fairness or anything. But at the time, the idea of egalitarianism, the idea of the American dream, the idea
Yeah,
that our country alone, an end to the reign of monarchs and cultural tropes, and the unspoken broken promise of that is no misogyny, no racism,
right,
no built-in cathexes.
right.
My first question to you is, when you were growing up in your household, how would your family have, would they have vilified that Henry Ford principle? Would they have gone like,
Well,
as the Seltzer family does, they're
right.
like, oh, this.
I mean, even if you weren't like the head of the Nazi Party of America, even if you weren't a Nazi, I think, yeah, I mean, because there was suspicion. And that's part of the problem, right? So I agree. I think there's like, and Seventh and his brothers talk about this of like, maybe that was a really great idea. Forget the past. This is a nation whose basic idea was there's no past. We're all the same. We're all born exactly the same. And that may have been, pie in the sky, and it may have been Pollyannish, and it may not even be what they were talking about because they were saying everybody except obviously Black people. But as a sort of concept on its own, why not? But as a kid, no, I all I heard were, so my grandparents came over, and or my great grandparents, and they came to Ellis Island, and the sons of bitches who were anti-Semites there changed their names. And so Rosenzweig became Roe, or Mordecai Deplowski became Johnny Depp, and those sons of bitches. And one of the things that was interesting in researching Ellis Island in particular for the book was there's absolutely no way that could possibly happen. The people at Ellis Island weren't in charge of changing names. They didn't even have those forms. If those things happened, it happened back in the old country. But most likely, which the families didn't want to talk about, was that their great 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 grandfather wanted to melt. He didn't want to be Johnny Deplowski. He wanted to be an American. The same way the guys walking up into that melting pot, that was the happiest day of their lives. And so there is this sort of bittersweet kind of, fuck, why did it have to go wrong? And why does it have to be that now we can't even talk about that without feeling bad about it?
Right.
And is there any sort of idealism left? Is there anything we can look forward to instead of, Zero, who's the only female in the family of the 12 brothers and mother for dinner,
And
and
who is
she's called
therefore
Zero,
pre-melted. She's been deprived of
pre-melted.
her.
Yeah,
She doesn't get a choice. She was melted
right,
in the womb.
right, because she doesn't count, and that's why they called her Zero. She points out she's the voice of that, of why are we listening to this grandfather of ours? He's a schmuck. He walks through life backwards, asking, constantly deciding what to do based on what people 500 years ago did. And that's not even bad enough, because the people 500 years ago were asking what the people 500 years before them were doing. So we're constantly living backward, and we're not looking forward. And there's this sort of broken dream about it all. And I don't have any answers to it other than to say, well, that sucks.
And what about the
Oh,
inverse
fuck.
of that, which is where the guilt comes in? Because of course it's very easy, especially if you're Zero, because you don't have a choice. And so, well, on one hand, she's the one that you can trust the most when she talks about the the philosophy we should hold. On the other hand, she's the one you can't trust at all, because, well, of course you'd have to say that you're the only girl in a culture
Right.
that says that because you're a girl you don't count. So of course you'd be progressive minded. Where else are you
Right.
going to hang your hat? Any port in a storm? The For Seventh, who I think it's fair to say is the protagonist and therefore kind of, is reflective reflective of you. I think you're
Mhm.
trapped in the middle of something. He represents the guilt.
Right.
He's imparted by the mother with when she's partitioning herself or appropriating whatever the ritual is called, where she's doling out her body parts on her deathbed to her children, and the ones that she doesn't like get her feet because they ran away from the family, etc. It's like one thing I found really funny about that scene, though, is like it's just funny, the distinction between, you can make anything sound. It's
Yeah.
like if you could
Horrible.
give your favorite kid your asshole and somehow
Right.
characterize it as like, because through it all things
Yeah.
are eventually go.
Yes.
And she
Yeah.
gives Seventh her skin, and she says, because you've always held the family together. And I think there's also a subtext there about skin and sensitivity and things, right?
Mhm.
Am I off
Yeah.
base here? That
Yeah.
I'm thinking about this book, The Drama of the Gifted Child. I'm thinking about you
Right.
growing up in a turbulent, patriarchal, so tribal, so this environment, and yet you are an elder in the making. You were born talented. Your brain shape is that of people who are supposed to write the new Bibles, and you're therefore being divested of more things. But also, it's possible for you you're the most vulnerable to total indoctrination, and
Right.
that's what that guilt is, right? Because Zero
Sure.
is saying, hey, what's with all this looking backwards? There's no point to it. Let's move forwards. Seventh is there is no, it seems like you took great care to make there be no rational internal logic to his fear of letting
Sure.
down the family, of
Yeah.
breaking
Because
the
right.
chain. So can you talk
Yeah.
about that
Because
guilt, like what the stakes
yeah.
are?
Yeah. Well, when I was growing up, and I hear it now, if you were to intermarry, um, uh, I remember telling this to a survivor of the Holocaust I was interviewing for a different book, that my mother told me, when I got caught eating McDonald's, that I was finishing what Hitler started. Um, yeah, and evidently Hitler started a Happy Meal, and I was finishing it.
I mean,
But it
what a
was,
dangerous game to play with your kid.
yeah.
Like, you don't know how good McDonald's is.
And
You're gonna make
incidentally,
Hitler a hero.
this survivor was livid. Like, she couldn't believe a parent would say that. And but you grow up with it. You grow up believing that, whatever you feel, you're not really important, because you're just one link on a very long chain. And the chain is only as strong as the individual links, but the individual links don't really get to have an opinion. So um, there's this tremendous pressure, like, that if you don't do what they say, and everything that's been prescribed, you're going to be the one that they talk about as being the one who brought down the Jews,
Right.
or the whoever's. And
But seventh in the book, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but
yeah,
seventh in the book isn't. You could have made it so easy. It would have been so easy for you to have him worried about going to cannibal hell. What is the? There is no actual. It's an illusion. It's obviously the guilt itself is generating the
yeah,
guilt. I mean, what is the
yeah,
terror? What if you are the reason why your family stops naming your kids in with the right
yeah,
suffixes? I mean, so go
yeah.
ahead. That was my brief interruption.
Um, well, I guess it's the same thing as if you were to say, well, okay, so there's a God and he's going to punish you. Like, so ultimately, so what? Like, you just live your life and you be your person. But when you're a child and the weight of history is on you, I recall being told oftentimes, like, you're going to be a really big rabbi. You're going to be really important to your people. So it wasn't just a question of here's this ordinary kid, or maybe even a bit of an oddball, because, to your point, I had too sensitive skin, which is something my father used to tell me. Um, um, but it was more than that. It was, I'm not just taking an ordinary Joe and walking away. I'm like, it's more, I was supposed to be, you know, the savior. I'm like, I'm the big rabbi who didn't, you know, the God who wasn't. And so it's twofold. It's you're leaving, but you're also not saving. So then all of a sudden it becomes, well, okay, there's a house on fire, and what am I going to do? You know, and it's a program. It doesn't happen easily. Like for me, the interesting thing with Seventh was that he was constantly going back and forth. There's never this moment of settling, even without, you know, spoiling at the end of the book. Like, I don't see him, you know, a year after the story ends, being confident in whatever decision he made. I think it's a struggle. I feel like there's a certain, I don't know, something admirable in agnosticism in terms of theology or in terms of identity, where you embrace the not knowing, where you don't say, I'm a this or I'm a that, or there is a God or there isn't God. A question mark isn't a terrible thing. It's not a bad tombstone. I prefer question marks to periods. And I hate exclamation points, but as a way of life, I feel like
what about
that's
those hand clapping emojis where people just like
emojis
go,
are my favorite.
you
Yeah.
are canceled because this is how it goes. The hand clapping emoji has trumped the
Yeah.
exclamation point.
Yes. So yeah. So
Go ahead.
So I feel like I wanted him to not be able to make a firm decision because to me, he is the hero, and heroes don't make firm decisions in my world. In my world, they stay wondering, they stay unsure. So it's not a question of, oh, you know, today I'm going to wear my yarmulke and tomorrow not. It's just, it might well be that we walk through life wondering. And that in itself is of value. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. I definitely do. Because going through therapy, I remember a big breakthrough I had is my therapist saying, when I was having a particularly troublesome time, she said, so what do you think's going on with this? And by the way, the answer can be, I don't know. And we had this big talk, and I remember her saying, how happy is certain Dan Harmon? Go back through your life and think about all the times you've been certain about things.
Right.
How happy are you?
Yeah.
And I'm like, I just
Right.
went through my head. I'm like, oh, I was certain that the other executive producers on this TV show were trying to undermine my authority, and I acted like a giant ass, and I was unhappy
Yeah.
about that certainty, and it was
Yeah.
absolutely not something to be certain about. Like,
Yeah.
and then you think about all of your uncertainties. Well, geez, you're uncertain when you're falling in love. You're uncertain when you're
Yeah.
just compelled to do things that you don't even understand why you're doing them. That's
Yeah.
joy. That's bliss. Chaos reigns supreme in your book, in this story. You made sure of that, which I find so interesting, that you made sure there was no poetry to the way the universe ran. It wasn't clockwork, nor was it the floating bag in American Beauty. Your universe, in which Cannibal Americans are possible, is one of an almost subversive, unremarkable chaos, where Murphy's Law is kind of like 70% in charge. Things are just misunderstood. The rhyme schemes of mnemonic devices are a little off kilter, and you end up not understanding this and that. And it's up for debate, not to spoil anything in the last third of your book, but it becomes up for debate what was taught to people and what was meant. And your uncleish character is a totally unreliable curator of that history.
Right.
You're doing that all intentionally, I think, as if to say, listen, you're not going to tame a universe with any religion. That's not what it's for. It's for coping with chaos.
Yeah.
And
and it's a very different thing than doubt, right? Or skepticism or cynicism. Uncertainty is its own thing. And, you know, it was Socrates who said, the only thing I know is that I don't know anything. And, you know, that's now probably a meme with a picture of a kitten on it that no one pays much of attention to. But, you know, it's probably the wisest thing ever said, which is why no one actually goes ahead with it. Because it's so easy. I grew up with people who were certain. They were certain about what the African Americans next door thought of us. They were certain about what the next Holocaust was going to be. Some of them were certain about when Messiah was going to come. They were certain what God said, who God's chosen people were, what you're supposed to say on this day. Certainty was everywhere. And it was completely fucked up. It didn't help at all. It didn't fix my father's alcoholism. It didn't fix my mother's narcissism. It didn't fix anything. So I have this sort of just general like repulsion or revulsion with anyone who wants to take a chessboard and say, this is where I stand.
And
I'm
that's
putting
your
a flag in the
your,
ground.
your matriarch character, Mud.
Yes.
That's what she
Yes.
represents. She's almost not.
Yeah.
She's not really human, right? And there's a meta commentary that goes throughout your book because there's a publishing industry within your universe, and so that you're able to have a meta channel where you're critiquing basically the one moment where you take a passing chance at humanizing Mud with a flashback. You also
Right.
simultaneously say, by the way, this constantly happens in all those stupid novels where why, you know, and you had a great quote that I can't remember about that was just sort of, it was just very apt about something like sometimes empathy for the other is
Cowardice.
is cowardice.
It's just cowardice. Yeah.
But yeah, you didn't use
Right.
empathy either. It was I was like, yeah, boy, you know what? We do that a lot, and it becomes all the more fashionable, as you point out too, where the American dream story on one side of a generational divide is it's just the third act of that great American so and so story that changes, whereas previously the end of it, the message is, if you keep up hope, America will reward you. And
Right.
then the modern new kind of fashionable way is to say, oh, I never should have lost my blank roots. I need to be more of that identity. I
Right.
shouldn't have let America tell me what to do. And
Right.
but this mother character, I don't know how much time we have left to chat before we go to the smarter people for the better questions, but I think it's so interesting that the one thing from your childhood now that pops up is this: it was patriarchal. That guy was the certainty lightning rod. In your book, it's the matriarch. The father is so human, he's out of the picture. He's almost frustratingly the dad. I was
Gone.
like, geez, this guy really must love his dad. And turns out no. Were you just was there so much charge there that you just felt obligated to flip the gender
Yeah.
role because you didn't
Yeah. 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 And in fact, there were many drafts where the mother started out with the mother dead. That was the opening scene. Mom's died and you got to come eat her, without any story or anything in the background. And yeah, there was no charge. There was no engine. It was just dead. There's a lot of people sitting around talking about her, but when you've got, someone who's nearly 7 feet tall and 400 pounds and hates every race and everything in the world, you can't not. You have to. It was like, well, I like starting the book that way with a corpse because it satisfies something in me. But if this is going to be a story that carries people along, I got to keep her alive a little bit. I got to make her the focus of it. And in fact, getting rid of the father,
even though she doesn't, and you totally avoid that thing that you made a comment on, which is like, you don't bother to humanize her. There's no scene where Archie Bunker turns out to have a soft spot for kittens. That would distract us with questions of, oh, is she a good person or a bad person? Your story is about dealing with what she represents, which is cultural legacy. She starts out with this philosophy which is very disturbingly pragmatic about biological warfare. She's just saying, let's have more sex than the other tribes, because do you see the Puerto Ricans or the Chinese like struggling 30 years from now when they've simply outbred everybody? She starts that pure in her and starts with this mission. The interesting thing is, she needs more than genetic proliferation. She doesn't care about her genes. Some of her children become her worst enemies. She's working with what she's got to proliferate culture, which makes her children hostages. She's almost a viral,
exactly.
And so the kids can either let her down or impress her with their ability to do which is just look behind and continue forward. It makes them all kind of hostages of this
Yeah.
woman that you don't bother to airbrush. I thought that was really effective, because then all of our focus is on seventh and imagining
Right.
what are we supposed to do.
Right. And she represents certainty, and if she's certainty, then there are no shades.
Yeah.
But to go back to the whole Kafka thing, like, I don't really care what Gregor Samsa's father's childhood was like. All I know is he was an asshole father who's trying to kill the bug in his house, even though he knows it's his son. Like, you don't always have to go into all of that stuff. But yeah, like that, you said, that is a good word for it, is this hostage situation.
Well,
and
you
I-
had much better words for it toward the when you were talking. You say it a couple times in the beginning and then towards the end, where you talk about your narrative, or can't remember how you phrased it, but it's sort of like you are born and you're being told. She told all her children what their stories were.
yes,
The gay
yeah,
one was born in a gay way. She used
yes,
stories with her children as a sort of like cattle prod to kind of like
yeah, yeah,
here's the increasingly mythical story of your birth, and here's who you are, and also in general, here's who you hate, and the answer is everybody.
right,
And
right. And in a
it's
weird way, it is a story about stories and the effect they have on us and what they're told. So it's one thing to be told everyone hates you, and so hate everybody else. It's another one to sit someone down and say, well, a long time ago, the Egyptians, who were very bad people, made slaves of your great grandfather, and they crushed babies. This is what I was
right.
told. They crushed babies and put them in the walls to use them as mortar. And even as a kid, you're going, I'm pretty sure that's a building code violation. I don't think that's structurally sound.
It can't be the best
But
mortar.
but I can't get that image out of my head,
Right.
right? So the stories are the things that are used. Those are the chains. And story is really unreliable. There is no certainty with a story. I can ask 100 different people 100 different stories. With my previous book, Hope, which had to do with Anne Frank and the Holocaust, I was convinced my whole life that they walked into camps and found lampshades made out of Jews. I thought that was only in IKEA. No, but then I find out, no, that's not the case. There were none. In fact, the one photo that there is of one was not one. It was just a lampshade
Just
that
a
they
bad
found
lampshade.
and said, yeah, it was just a bad lampshade. And they're like, yeah, things like this.
Right.
But imagine it was made of skin. And so, like, we don't know what these stories are, and yet we let those stories tell us how to live our lives, who to love, who to hate, what we can and can't do.
It could be that's the
And what
only
the future is
redeeming
going
thing
to be.
possible about that melting pot thing. Maybe that's the part of me as a white privileged, like lapsed Lutheran who doesn't have. I get to look at that story and go, what a delightful thing that would be to achieve agency. Because if
Right.
you go in wearing your lederhosen and you come out wearing a little suit, to me, what suit means is opportunity. And what opportunity means is agency. And if that promise were kept, if that really were a story of erasure of your cathexes and being handed the keys to the kingdom, then everyone could agree that was a wonderful ritual.
Yeah.
But as it turns out, it's probably just one cult swapping for another. It's just Scientology
Right.
saying, "Hey, you're currently a junkie. How'd you like to trade heroin for L. Ron Hubbard?" It's just
Yeah.
just people just that want your
Yeah.
time in your life.
But I have heard people even today talk about, the trouble with the West, or the trouble with the world, is we don't have a narrative going forward. That when God died, and now capitalism is hopefully killing itself. But what's the narrative? Like, what's that question is just, what's our story? What's the story that drives us forward? So I look back at, Americanization Day, and I think for me it's sad because it was a nice story. And yeah, you can say that's all that it was, and that is all that it was, maybe for some. But boy, it must have been nice to have that story. Like, when you ask, like, did my family have, look back at that and say, oh, it's terrible, and, hatred and anti-Semitism? They did. Everything was colored by color. Everything was colored by race and religion and everything. And it kind of was like, that must have been nice, when Seventh is talking in the book about their daughter, and there's a point in the development of a baby where it's neither male nor female. It's just nothing. And he just thinks, wow, what a great time that must have been to be not one thing or the other. And I feel like that's probably the true. I long for that split second
Yeah.
of fetal life.
Your father, and the father character in the book, has an interesting take on the idea of love thy neighbor as yourself. His take on it is, or is it the father character that
Yeah,
has that take?
yeah,
That he chooses to interpret the as meaning simultaneously, or the moment when.
while,
Once you love yourself, don't
yeah,
forget to love your neighbor, because it's actually the point where very few people do love themselves, and when they do, as great as that could be, it tends to make them stop loving their neighbors. Actually,
right.
it's like
Yeah,
it's as
hey,
if identity is something we seek, but then when we get it, we punish everyone around us.
yeah, and you can't be, and this isn't about Judaism, but I'm just using this term, but you can't be chosen without other people being unchosen. You know what I mean? Like, we stand around in the US and say number one, that automatically makes everybody else number two. It's already a judgment. Do you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
that's the danger of all these differences, is that there's no way to do it. So he says, love your neighbor as, meaning while you're loving yourself, take a minute and just hit the brakes, tap the brakes a little bit,
Don't forget
because
empathy. Yeah.
because that's when you start going, oh no, and here a bunch of Latinos moved next door.
Exactly. I love my life. I love my neighborhood. When am I going to get fucked?
Yeah, exactly. There go my property taxes.
All right. So what? Andrea.
Yeah,
Andrea's here.
Andrea's here.
I'm here. Thank
Welcome
you.
back.
Thank you. That was so fun. I have a bunch of questions from people who have emailed and sent in questions just now. So what can fiction and satire do for you, Shalom, that nonfiction can't?
It could be more easily sold to Hollywood. Well, actually, for me, I think they both ultimately do the same thing. They just go about it in different ways. There's an aspect to fiction where you can, of remove, where you just go, this isn't me. This is a Cannibal American and his mother, and I don't have anything at risk here. But the minute you write me and I and mom and dad, that's a whole other thing. So it gives, for me, I like writing both because I guess nonfiction feels like being in surgery. You're in there and you're cutting open everything and you're tearing all the tubes out and blood's flying everywhere. And fiction is a little bit more like being in the viewing area, watching the doctors do that, where it's not so much, where I'm a little bit less on the table. And that might sound like, oh, that's a little bit cowardly, but you actually can learn different things from different vantage points. If I'm always sitting there going, why did I do this when I was 25? And how come I just masturbated to some horrifying pornography? I'm like, oh God, I might not want to go to those places. I might not be as honest. Whereas if I can step back and go, that's not me, that's Jim. And Jim does that because Jim hates his dad. Like, I can find out things about myself. So it's a question of like moving back and forth between those distances, where if something's a little too close to the bone, then the mask of fiction helps. And what tends to happen is that I'll be working on both at the same time, because I'm just working on whatever. And the piece that I'm working on that's nonfiction will inform the fiction, because I'll find something out about myself and go, oh, maybe that's why that character did that in the fiction, and vice versa, where I'll be in the fiction, the guy will do something, or this woman will say something, and I go, oh, wait a minute, that's me talking to myself. I need to go back to that and think about that. So it's just different approaches.
Okay, all of your books, this is sort of a tag onto that. All of your books drive a dagger through the organized Orthodox Jewish community. Which book has had the sharpest or loudest reaction from that community? And I would actually add fiction or nonfiction, and do you care?
Well, I'll start with the second half of that question. I don't care, which is why I don't really know the answer to the first half of the question. I don't really follow it. I've spoken with Dan about this a lot because we've gotten together a bunch of times, and I watched with such heartache how his being at the time being so hooked into social and news and the world was driving him slightly mad. And I was always like, I don't read it. I don't get involved with it. I'm not on social. I don't have a Twitter. I don't Facebook. I don't do anything. I have my kids and my wife and my dogs, and I get up and I write and I send it in to whoever wants to see it. And I try to stay away from it because however it's going to influence me, it's not going to be positively.
Which I used to think was insane and not true. And now I understand. Because I was like,
now he won't leave his closet.
If you're on Twitter, how do you know how your dog is doing? I was the insane one, but it was,
right.
Amazing.
Oh my God, it was so crazy. And I know so many people like that. And I get that way. Look, the past 2 weeks with the election, man, I fell off that wagon fast, or on whatever it is. For 3 days, I was just like, my kids didn't even recognize me. And my son afterward was like, God damn, Dad, it was so tense here the past few days. And I'm like, yeah, I'm sorry. That was just so stupid. And I'm like, I'm down in the comment section of Daily Kos or something from like never reading anything. And within 3 days, I'll be like voracious reading everything and hating myself. I can't imagine what I would do. I would just have to move into my shrink's house if I actually Googled what one of my books did with this particular community or that particular community. I couldn't take it.
Okay, here's a good question. Old habits die hard. In an interview you did for Foreskin's Lament, you said that every aspect of your life was under strict control. Which hand you wash first, even how you put your pants on. In what ways do you still unconsciously adhere to those rules?
I don't adhere to the rules. I mean, what that's a reference to is that in that Orthodox world, there's nothing that isn't prescribed from day one. How you do everything, whether you can have a knife on the table during this blessing because some rabbi killed somebody. It's bananas. No, it's like it makes it makes Sedaris talking about his OCD sound healthy, and so for me, what's remained is the complete ludicrous terror that if I step on a crack, I will break my mother's back. I don't not step on the crack, and I don't walk off the sidewalk, but I'm vaguely aware as I'm walking down it that I've fractured her spine about 15 times since I left the house. So I'm just aware of the horribleness and the possible repercussions, but I don't go to the bathroom and then wonder which hand I washed first. I mean, except during COVID.
Right. Well, you're supposed to wash both of them, by the way. So.
Oh shit!
That's a myth.
That's a myth. I'm a super spreader.
You can only get COVID from your left hand.
Which authors made you stand up and say, "I want to do this"? When you were younger, which authors had you read that made you say, "I want to do this for a living," or "I have to do this"?
Well, Moses had this set of 5 books that was really interesting, but the first person was Kafka. I mean, I was lucky that I didn't have like a really great literary education and that I didn't go to college because I didn't have all that stuff ruined for me. by academics or people telling me what he did or didn't do. Or if someone had said to me, here's a book of short stories that are about bureaucracy, I don't think I ever would have read Kafka. But instead I found this guy in a bookstore who was really funny about his asshole family and feeling shitty. And he, in one story, he goes to see his dad and say, hey, I wrote a letter to my friend. And 2 seconds later, his father's condemning him and he runs out and drowns himself. And I thought that was the funniest thing I'd ever read. So to me, it was presented as funny. And then I remember going back to the same bookstore. It was Gotham Book Mart in Manhattan. It's no longer. It's Starbucks, and saying, okay, that was funny. What else is funny? And they kind of gave me a little tour. Like I went from Kafka to Beckett, which was hilarious. Again, because I didn't know that he was supposed to be serious. I mean, Godot ends with a guy's pants falling down because he's taking his belt off to try and hang himself. When I found out that that was like, something they studied in college, I thought, yeah, maybe I'm not going to college. I'm not sure I need that. But it was just kind of finding one of, so then there was, those two were probably the big ones. I would say Heller for a while. Flannery O'Connor I thought was hilarious because of the South and God and messed up families and guilt. And then there were others along the way that, mostly there was this weird crossover between literary people and stand-up comedians. So at the same time as I was reading
ask you about Steve
Kafka,
Martin, because there's such a Steve Martin-esque like flow to some of your stuff. When he's going down the birth orders and the names of the kids and,
right,
and then it all gets tangled, that felt very Steve Martin comedy album to me.
Yeah, and right, exactly. Or like really early Albert Brooks. But whether it was Bill Hicks or Dick Gregory or Woody Allen, like I would be reading them and then Waiting for Godot or reading Joyce, and I found them all to be very similar. I thought they were all kind of doing the same thing. And I just said, well, years later, when I was encouraged to write by a shrink, I was like, well, maybe I can do that, because all I was doing until then was just writing furious, angry rants that even I couldn't be bothered to read. But then thought, oh, maybe I'll try doing that thing. I remember there being some writers back then that I thought maybe I can do that jokey stuff. Of course, now you say that and it's an insult because it's not taken seriously. But the Greeks had this great saying that tragedy was a view of man and comedy was a view of God. And that's kind of what I felt Beckett and Kafka were doing, among others.
I think that's a great place to end on. And I so appreciate your coming. This book is so great. It's singular. You won't have read anything like this, I promise, but it's pure Shalom Auslander. I want to thank you so much. And I want to thank Dan. Absolutely terrific. And
thank you for having
this is why I do Writer's Block, is it's stuff like this. And I so appreciate it. So there are signed book plates at Chevalier's. Go to our website and find the link to Chevalier's. And we'll see you soon.